Breast milk isn't just food, it's a community of bacteria that's constantly shifting. A new study asked whether that bacterial community shifts and changes depending on whether a baby feeds directly from the breast or from a bottle. The answer turns out to be pretty interesting, and also it gets tangled up in a few other things that are happening all at the same time. Welcome back, I'm Joanna, I'm a mum to 2, and I'm making short videos on research-based academic paper data on various parenting topics. Breastfeeding is something I'm doing quite a lot of, education, nursery, language acquisition, behaviour, anything that I think is quite interesting. And the idea is that we are able to make informed decisions by looking at some of these papers and ideally become better parents. That is kind of the goal. If you like that idea, please do hit like and subscribe. I'd love to have you follow along. So today's study is a study published in December 2024 called Microorganisms by Wortman and colleagues. The families are coming from a larger and ongoing research cohort called Upside and includes 327 mother-infant pairs in total. From that big pool, the researchers deliberately selected a clean subgroup of 14 dyads, so mum and baby, specifically excluding any family that have any known disruptors from a baby's microbiome, for instance a caesarean birth, any formula feeding, any antibiotic use. So the point of the kind of picky selection in terms of data here is to try and isolate the feeding method as cleanly as possible as the one thing that was different and distinct between the different groups. So within those 14 families, 6 were doing express breast milk, defined as 2 or more bottles of pumped milk in a typical working day, and 8 of those families were doing direct breastfeeding from the breast, with fewer than 2 bottles a day. Researchers collected both breast milk samples, about 30 millilitres, and infant stool samples twice, once at about 1 month after birth and around 6 months after birth as well. And in the lab, they extracted bacterial DNA from both types of samples, so the breast milk and the stool, and sequenced a specific standard genetic marker, the V4 region of a gene called 16S RNA, essentially a bacterial barcode region used to identify which species are present. And they did this on an Illumina MySeq machine. If you want all the details, you can have a look in the study, I'll link it in my bio. Now, what is microbiome diversity? Alpha diversity is a measure of how many different types of bacteria are present in one sample and how evenly balanced they are, like counting how many different types of species live in a garden, not just how many plants there are in total. Beta diversity compares whether 2 different samples, say one mother's breast milk versus another mother's breast milk, look different or similar in their bacterial makeup overall. So let's look at the research. A baby's own gut bacteria was consistently less diverse than the bacteria in the milk itself, and that was at both 1 month and 6 months. Breast milk, in other words, carries a much richer bacterial community than what's actually established in the infant's gut from their stool. So then let's look at the feeding method findings specifically. As babies got older, the diversity in the milk itself increased over time, but only in the pumped milk group. In the direct breastfeeding group, the same age-related rise in milk diversity did not show up, which is pretty interesting. There was a substantial bacterial sharing between milk and infant stool, spanning loads of different bacteria, including well-known ones like Bifidobacterium and Streptococcus. Importantly, the actual number and prevalence of the shared bacteria groups was no different between the pumped and the direct feeding groups. So the basic overlap between milk bacteria and gut bacteria looked pretty similar regardless of the feeding method. And it was specifically the milk's own diversity trajectory over time that differed. There was also a network level finding looking at how strongly different bacteria in the milk co-occurred with each other. In the pumped milk group, the milk showed a trend of a more tightly interconnected bacterial community, while the direct breastfeeding group's milk showed a separated, dispersed cluster of bacteria. But it is worth flagging that this finding was only trending towards statistical significance. It was just short of the conventional threshold for statistical significance, so it should only be treated as suggestive, not conclusive. The breast milk overall was enriched in bacteria typically found on skin, like Streptococcus, while the infant stool carried bacteria that you'd expect to find in a developing gut. Something that's worth noting though is that the 2 feeding groups were not identical with one another. The pumped milk group, they were much more likely to introduce solid food significantly earlier on, around 4.5 months old, compared to 5.5 months old in the direct breast milk group. And this also plays a pretty important role. What do the researchers make of their results? Well, the researchers' leading explanation is pretty interesting. Direct breastfeeding is a two-way biological exchange. The baby's mouth latches on and touches the nipple directly, creating what they call an opportunity for oral breast transmission of microbes. The bacteria moves both ways between baby and breast. Researchers propose that could be why pumped milk bacteria behaves differently over time. They also raise a second, quite different possible explanation. Pumped milk typically goes through storage and warming before it reaches the baby, and that process itself could change the milk. And that could include the bacterial content as well. They also note that heating the milk above 62 Celsius could plausibly contribute to some of the differences that were seen. So, can we trust this study? What do we make of it? So the authors themselves are pretty upfront about what they can and what they can't tell us. So most obviously, this is a pretty small study. There were 6 diets in one group and 8 in the other. This is a limitation of their own study, and so we can't generalize. It's more of an exploratory study. Most importantly, there's a pretty significant confounding factor here. The pumped milk group introduced solid food a month earlier on than the direct breastfeeding group. And that itself is statistically significant. Introducing food is independently known to reshape a baby's gut microbiome, and that means that the feeding method effect could be tangled up with the timing of introducing solid food, and the study can't separate the two. The authors also flag maternal employment as a factor as well. Pumping is often driven by a mother returning to work, and that means that pumped milk group may differ in the direct feeding group in all sorts of associated ways: daily routine, stress levels, the different types of caregivers that are involved, and also environmental exposures at the workplace when they're pumping. And that might have nothing to do with pumping itself, but all of the things that come along with it. And they also have to bear in mind that the idea about the network connectivity between clusters of bacteria, that didn't really cross the threshold for statistical significance, so it's worth being aware of, but we can't conclude with that. But what they did do well in this study is that they eliminated any data sets that had other potentially known factors like C-sections, no formula, no antibiotics. And so it was careful to design this study in terms of being able to try to isolate the different feeding methods. So what can we take away from this? What is the point for us as a mum or a dad? There are no health outcome measured here in either group, so nothing in this study shows that any baby is worse off, is more likely to get sick or develop differently based on whether they had pumped milk or directly from the breast. This study is about patterns of bacterial communities, not about the baby's health overall. If you expressed or partly pumped, there's genuinely nothing to worry about here. The authors themselves describe this as preliminary and would like to research further to actually find out whether there is any consequence to a baby's health. One thing that comes through clearly and consistently across this entire research field is that breast milk, however it reaches your baby, whether it's pumped or whether it's direct, carries a rich living bacterial community that genuinely contributes to what is ending up in your baby's gut. And that is true regardless of feeding method. If you did like it, please do hit like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments, did you know that breast milk had its own microbiome? I'll link all of the studies in the links in my bio so you can have a little look. And hopefully I'll see you for another video. I'll see you later.